I would like to welcome you and also express my appreciation for joining me as I make this presentation. My name is Brighton Cavallo, a minister of religion of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and also do currently serve as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director of the South England Conference. As I make this presentation, like you, I'm deeply aware that the COVID virus has left in its wake unimaginable suffering, pain, grief, and loss of lives, both domestically and internationally. I'm also mindful of those who have been left behind, the bereaved, and others still hospitalized, receiving treatment, and those who may since have returned to their homes of abode, but still recovering. My prayers continue for them. Let us pray. Our gracious and kind, loving Heavenly Father, I pray that you will guide my thoughts as I share this important message. And for those listening, may you help them to benefit. Continue to bless and keep each one of us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I would like now to share with you my screen. Thank you for this opportunity. COVID status certification. To be or not to be. The question out there is, will it also be introduced in worship places? Now, call it whatever you prefer. Vaccine certificate, freedom pass or ID, or vaccine passport. To go to church for worship, you carry in the main the Bible, the church hymnal or songbook. Indeed, like my denomination, the Sabbath school quarterly lesson. Will you need to include the fourth item, vaccine passport? I know the General Conference and the church leadership position is that it is a personal decision or choice to be or not to be vaccinated. But as I make this presentation, I also believe that, like my department, the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty, can and must do more to update its constituency so that they are able to make each one of them well-informed decision. I would like to even be stronger than that, to suggest it is the moral duty of the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty to keep its constituency informed. Other venues or places have already been earmarked by the government, where crowds or those who congregate will be required to produce a vaccine passport to be let in. But let me emphasize this point, that church venues have not been included in the first list. However, I fully agree with two of our parishioners who, when they saw the flyer you earlier were shown, texted, I quote, "It is such an important topic to discuss." The other wrote, "This is great, much needed topic." Therefore, the purpose of this presentation overall is to seek to begin to unpack the potential implications, ramifications, and impact of COVID status certification system about to be introduced, apparently, from two perspectives. Number one, from the role played by the service provider of COVID status certification system, which is the government. They are service providers. Then the service user, the general public, you and me out there. And if you may even want to narrow this, even in those in worship places. But as we begin, obviously, I would like this presentation to be guided by principle. Therefore, I would like to share with you 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. The same verse, but in two translations. First, in the New King James Version says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready," and I highlighted, "to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear." A more modern version, the Amplified Bible, puts it so vividly this way: "But in your hearts, set Christ apart as holy and acknowledge him as Lord. Always, not even when, always be ready," and highlighted, "to give a logical defense to anyone who asks you to account for the hope that is in you, but do it courteously and respectfully." Three things, very important, I would like to bear in mind as I go through this presentation. And I would want to invite you, our listeners, or the audience out there, that we bear in mind. First, the acknowledgement of Jesus in my life as sovereign Lord. Let him set apart to take center stage as you are directed to make decisions. Secondly, when you come to decision making, provide a logical defense to anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. Can I bring it much closer? Guided by the Spirit of God, with Jesus in your heart. If someone asks you, would you want to be vaccinated or not? it's left to you to put that information together, guided to make not just a decision, but a logical decision. Thirdly, and as you do so, do it courteously and respectfully. I'm very much aware there are many opinions out there, but each individual, as they make their own decision to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated, must not be a bone of contention, but to accept and respect and be courteous to each decision that is made. And let me repeat, as I go through this presentation, you may see, you may hear something that may startle you. This biblical principle, I will adopt, and I'm encouraging you to adopt, that together we remain calm, logical, courteous, and respectful, whatever your public or religious opinion may be, so that the liberty of conscience is not curtailed. As we move forward, I would like to use this source as the main source of my presentation. You will remember I said the government is the service provider. I will seek to unpack some implications, some ramifications, some impact possibly already coming through, so that not only my audience, but my constituency, me as the power leader, I keep them updated and informed and be aware. So you will see, I'm not using a social media platform. Others may wish to do so. I respect that. Others may just want to listen to the television news or possibly read national newspapers. But I would like to use the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, who have been really at the center of looking into this system, COVID status certification. You will see the slide before you. This is really the current report that there is. You can see 2021 to 22. The report, together with formal minutes relating to the overall report, has been already ordered by the House of Commons to be printed. And this, you can see with the code HC42, was published on the 12th of June, 2021 by the authority of the House of Commons. I'm having to go through this because I don't want just to assume everyone has heard of this committee, and I'll have a little bit more to say about it. Now, in its report on the COVID status certification, on page 30, where you find the conclusions and recommendations on the government's review and the purpose of COVID status certification, the committee came up with this statement. Point number 4. I read, and it's me who has highlighted so that you are able to follow me in the areas I'll seek to emphasize. While the government has not set out the locations, events, and venues which would be included in a COVID status certification system, it did provide some indications that the certification might be used for venues such as nightclubs, large events like football matches, and for international air travel, but would not be used for corporation buses or the underground or in small businesses such as standard pubs and restaurants. In the green shed, it is clear from the evidence we heard that the indoor locations, which are densely packed, noisy, and poorly ventilated, pose the high risk of transmission, even after vaccination. However, this description could easily apply to some of those premises that have not been mentioned, but premises which the government has indicated would be included in the scope of the COVID status certification system, and those which it does not envisage such a system applying to. This gives the impression that if it were to introduce such a system, decisions would be made almost arbitrarily and would not be based on scientific or public health reasons. The committee is concerned that it appears as if the government has preempted the conclusions of its own review and made decisions on largely arbitrary basis as to what locations will be included or exempted from the system, regardless of the scientific evidence. Really? Arbitrary? Let me take you to the next, which was in the same document, but in the summary section. On page 3, it said, overall, we found that the government has not established a clear scientific case, nor a good overriding public interest case for the introduction of the COVID status certification system. There remain, in red letters here, there remained a large number of uncertainties about the rationale for an operation of such a system, as well as serious ethical concerns in regards to discrimination and infringement of individual rights and significant data protection concerns. And when we consider that the government's own assessment that the case for introduction is finally balanced, the shade in green highlighted, it is our clear recommendation that the government abandon the idea of using a COVID status certification system domestically. You may say, Brighton, is this worth bringing to the public domain? Yes. It's good for my constituency and for the public to know the views of this committee. Whatever decision they may make, they are made aware of the debate that is still possibly out there. For those who may not be fully told what this Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee does, it is a Commons Select Committee, as you read there. It is appointed by the House of Commons to examine constitutional issues. So it must not be taken lightly. You'll see it is chaired by Mr. William Rogg, MP. And when you read further, you'll be informed that it is able to scrutinize, constitutional issues, but also hold the government to account in certain areas, serving as a watchdog, really. So I'm having to saying that because whatever it says, I myself would not take lightly, but it will give me some food for thought as I work this whole idea of COVID certification system. Now, I just want you to see this committee really in action for a moment also.
Order. Good afternoon and welcome to a public meeting of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. This evidence session is to consider the use of COVID vaccine certificates, which have also been colloquially called vaccine passports. The committee has received a record number of written submissions to this inquiry, and I'd like to thank all of those who took the time to share their evidence with the committee. Given the volume of this evidence, it will take officials some time to process, but please be assured we are taking note of all the views shared with the committee.
I brought this slide because the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee have conducted oral evidence, as you can see right now, but also called the public and organizations to a call for evidence to provide their own views on COVID vaccine certification. On record, as you heard, there were 9,000 written submissions from the public and organizations. That was very substantial. And I'm glad, hence my really taking part in this presentation, that my organization, the South England Conference, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty, was among the 9,000 who submitted their response. You'll see there, thank you for submitting written evidence to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee's inquiry, COVID-19 vaccine certification. Thank you for your interest in this work. This was not the first time. Last year, as we came out of the first lockdown, the Human Rights Joint Committee, here again, a joint select committee from the this one, a joint committee of the human rights appointed by both houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, to examine relating matters to human rights within the United Kingdom, as well as scrutinizing them, put up a call for evidence at the time. And this had to do, if you please, with the government's response to COVID-19 human rights implications. We also took part in that submission. I think you will have noted right there that thank you for submitting written evidence to the Human Rights Joint Committee's inquiry, the government's response to COVID-19 human rights implications. The committee has accepted your submission and that was in August last year, 2020. And they actually published it, acknowledged our 1,500 word article. Thank you for your interest in our work. So I'm just bringing this to give you a background of why I am wanting to follow through the House of Commons committees and how they are relating this issue, as it were. Obviously, my organization, the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty in the South England Conference, and then in the House of Parliament on the Human Rights website, you'll find our written evidence. Its code is COVO 174. What did we, in response, write? What was our subject in that article? You'll see right there, UK COVID-19 vaccination, human rights compliance, compulsory or consensual? That was the question we posed at the time. Should vaccination be compulsory, mandatory, or consensual, as it were? You can see it's in a question form. And even for this certification, we are saying in a question form, will it also be needed in places of worship? Going back to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee oral evidence, apart from the written evidence, there have been 3 meetings. First on the 23rd of March, then followed the 24th of May, you can see on my right, on your right possibly, and then the 27th of May. And I've had really admiration when, I must confess, I may not have listened to all the interviews, but I managed to listen to quite a few, and they were very enlightening. Although there were areas I was not really in agreement, but I respected the views of scientists and medical professionals because there were areas I'd never thought about. So it's not just good to be dismissive. Remember our biblical principle. You may have your own opinion, but respect and be courtesy to other people's views while you make your own logical defense of the decision you make. That said, it was, as a matter of fact, one of the committees that Professor Merinda Mills was interviewed. She came much earlier in the questioning. And as I listened to her, it was put to her, what should be in place, this certification system, what should be in place? In a very succinct manner, as I listened to her, there were indeed 4 things she highlighted. And this almost to me was almost like the terms of reference to the committee. It was brilliant. Let me read to you. If a certificate system is to be introduced by the government, there needs to be a clear set of criteria and evidence by which to judge the policy proposals. Clarity is needed. Professor Mills told us, oh, by the way, if I may mention, she was introduced as the professor of demography from University of Oxford. Professor Mills told us that in order to assess whether a certificate system can achieve its purpose, there must be 4 main elements. 4. 1, the science around COVID infection and immunity must be made clear. 2, ethical and discrimination issues cannot just be dismissed as not important to the public. 3, technical issues about how certificates which will be expected. How are they going to operate? How are they going to work? That must be clarified. Who will reinforce it? 4, data privacy and security must also be looked into. With those said, I would like to highlight about 5 areas that the Constitutional Administration and Public Affairs Committee brought out. The first was that the COVID status certification statements that have since been given out there were conflicting and contradictory. You remember, clarity is very important for the public as they make their logical conclusions and decisions. But was it? I would like that committee to share with you what they came up with. In the summary, COVID status certification, they say, the government is currently undertaking a review looking into potential introduction of a COVID status certification system to help, quote unquote, handle COVID-19 from this summer onwards. According to the government, the purpose of the certificate system would be to play a role in reopening our economy, reducing restrictions on social contact, and improving safety. But then the committee goes on. It is clear that the idea of certificates has been under consideration within the government for at least 6 months. However, the conflicting and sometimes contradictory statements made by ministers on the possibility of introducing certificates has risked damaging trust in government and in the measures put in place to tackle pandemic. Coming back to me, is that important to note? Yes. Remain respectful, but be able to follow through this so that with those I minister to, I'm responsible for, they are aware to look out for certain areas that could help them, I repeat, make informed decisions. They went further. If I may just come to the red aspect, I won't read everything. They said, from ministers and officials have been giving conflicting statements on the possibility of certification being introduced as a measure, and on the extent to which proposals were actively under review. At times, these statements have been directly contradictory. At the very least, this demonstrates a lack of coordination and effective interworking between different departments and teams in the government's response to COVID. Then I said, wow, was there conflicting of ideas? Did my own study and discovered, indeed, some things that one could raise an eyebrow, albeit I'm mindful that to lead at a time like this can be very challenging. Possibly if I were in the shoes of these ministers, I could not have done anything better. However, it doesn't take away that as their own committee in the House of Parliament are scrutinizing them, the public must also have the opportunity to scrutinize them so that the decision the public makes is kosher, is sound, one way or the other. Well, Nadine Zahawi, the vaccine minister, sounds contradictory to me. Listen to what he said in the early stages of this.
The petition we are debating this evening is a matter of great legal and ethical, as the member for Wickham quite rightly reminded us, complexity. But before I address some of those complexities, I wish to set out the facts as they stand today. Sir David, first, there are currently no plans to place restrictions on those who refuse to have a COVID vaccine at all. Further to this, we have, as the member for Carshalton and Walton reminded us, no plans to introduce so-called vaccine passporting. I think the member for High Wycombe quite rightly was slightly nervous. I did my first interview, I think it was with the BBC, where they were asking me about some of the challenges. I talked about some of the technological challenges around this, and I may have misspoken. I was grateful to the Spectator and the Talk Radio, who allowed me to then explain myself. I think mandating vaccinations is discriminatory and completely wrong, and I, like the member for High Wycombe and others here, would urge businesses listening to this debate today not to even think about this, and I will explain in further detail why that is the wrong thing to do. I'm grateful, and I'll put on record my thanks to Professor Carol Sikora, who quoted me and said I eloquently dealt with the issue. He has many hundreds of thousands of followers, which I was very grateful for. So absolutely no plans for vaccine passport.
There are four things, if you followed Mr. Zahawi. One, there are currently no plans to place restrictions on those who refuse to have a COVID vaccine at all. Two, no plans to introduce vaccine passporting. Absolute no plans. Three, businesses must not even think about it. Four, vaccine passport, says the vaccine minister, is wrong and discriminatory. Not long from now, in the Tuesday, February 16th, 2021, the Times, not long from that time, COVID vaccine passports up to each business. Here, business should not even think about it. Possible an explanation may be needed. Well, you read this clip. The introduction of vaccine passports is a matter for individual businesses. We're told it was not. The government has admitted, opening the door for companies to only let those who have had the jab come to work or use their services. The newspaper, The Times, continued, despite weeks of tough rhetoric over the idea of a certificate scheme, ministers do not at present plan to forbid companies from introducing them. I think this contradictory and confusing when the public was having to make decision one or the other can better be handled. And indeed, the Constitutional Committee followed. I'm not saying on the example that I gave, but there were four officials, as you'll see in that clip, four giving conflicting messages. Yes, we will have immunity passports. No, we won't. Yes, we will. No, we won't. And the public have to be deciding, shall we not? Some clarity is always important. That was contradiction and so forth. Let me come to COVID status certification being seen as a system of discriminatory. I will start by the committee's statement itself. The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. The committee also noted that COVID status certification system would be, by its very nature, be discriminatory. The vaccine minister used that word as well, and would likely disproportionately discriminate against some people on the basis of race, religion, and socioeconomic background, as well as on the basis of age. Okay, what was being said was indeed a legal issue, because you will appreciate that the following characteristics are protected under Equality Act 2010. I highlighted that which has been mentioned by the committee: age, race, and religion and belief. On point 64, they came back on the same issue. A COVID status certification system would be, by its very nature, be discriminatory. The evidence of vaccine uptake is a clear indication that such a system would likely disproportionately discriminate against people. On what basis? On the basis of race, religion, socioeconomic background, and age. Possibly, let me come to the middle part. In all situations, the committee was requesting that a proportionality and a necessity be looked into. And you'll see at the bottom of that slide their recommendation. Based on what they have just said, we recommend that the government abandon the idea of using a COVID status certification system domestically. This was used earlier. They come back on it. Well, discriminatory COVID status were the early indications that this will be problematic. Yes, from our Prime Minister himself, Boris Johnson. Listen, in the early stages of the discussion for COVID status certification, what he said.
This is an area where, we're looking at a novelty for our country. We haven't had stuff like this before. We've never thought in terms of having something that you have to show to go to, a pub or a theatre. And so there are deep and complex issues that we need to explore, ethical issues about what the role is for government in mandating or people to have such a thing, or indeed banning people from doing such a thing. There are complex issues we need to work out. We can't be discriminatory against people who...
We can't be discriminatory. For the sake of our time, I just cut it. I just want you to hear that word. We cannot be discriminatory. And before long, he, in a different setting, reiterated that COVID status certification may just be discriminatory. Listen to the second interview.
I want to stress that there are complicated ethical and practical issues, as I think I said last time, raised by the idea of COVID status certification, because for vaccination, using vaccination alone, just because after all, many people will be, for one reason or another, unable to get a vaccine for medical reasons, for instance, or perhaps because they're pregnant or whatever. So you've got to be very careful in how you handle this, and don't start a system that's discriminatory.
Don't start a system that is discriminatory. You have to handle this carefully. And I applaud that. Based on age, religion, socio-economic, we have to handle this issue. And the public must really appreciate that this issue is being handled sensitively. I'd like to now bring you to Mr. David Davis, very seasoned and most senior British politician. At one time, you will recall, he was the Brexit minister. Interestingly, what you're going to hear was part of the oral evidence from the same committee we are referring ourselves to, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. He was giving his evidence, and really what moved me, he said, oh, for whatever reason, he had received the job himself. But he said he could not sit there and not be seen to defend or to stand up or to say something of those who would not have made a decision like him for their rights. Listen attentively. It's just a short clip within some of the things that he said really that moved me personally as a pastor, that would I hold to my opinion as the be-all end-all, or would I hold my opinion and still come in defense of those, unlike me, who too must be considered? Listen carefully. Mr. David Davis.
Now, the reasons against passport, there are many, but let me pick off a few. A domestic passport. Let me pick off a few. Firstly, the impact of this would be discriminatory. Under the law, it will be indirectly discriminatory, and that is illegal. You may well find, it has been said, that black and ethnic minority communities are less inclined to get vaccinated. Well, that would be an indirect discrimination.
During that time, he also reminded, during the interview, that UK is out of the EU, European Union, but we are still signatories of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is run by the Council of Europe. The two are different. The European Union as an organization, but also the Council of Europe that operates the human rights aspect. He went and reminded the committee members and reminded me too. I had something to learn here. He pointed of Resolution 2361, 2020, which still applied to us in the UK, apparently. 731 says, the state which is a signatory to this convention must ensure that its citizens are informed that the vaccination is not mandatory and that no one is politically, socially, or otherwise pressured to get themselves vaccinated if they do not wish to do so themselves. 732, ensure that no one is discriminated against for not having been vaccinated. due to possible health risks or not wanting to be vaccinated. Mr. David Davis brought that point home really to me so powerfully as I listened. Another aspect the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, Select Committee, brought up was the COVID status certification system, that it was not fully proven, as it were. In their statement, they wrote, given the significance and seriousness of introducing such a COVID status certification system, the committee was surprised at the lack of consideration by the government of a number of issues and concerns with their suggested approach, in particular, the scientific case for that system. At the very end, if you please, in blue, the committee was struck by the fact that the best assessment the minister could make in favor of certificates was to say that, well, it was finally balanced judgment. I would like to say that the South England Conference, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty had earlier, as we came out of the first lockdown in 2020, during the call for evidence put out there by the Human Rights Joint Select Committee, the slide before you was one of our recommendations that the government really needed to take to be in keeping with COVID-19 pandemic human rights compliance. I'm just bringing this to saying that the aspect, as you'll see in red, number 2, that even in areas of public health response to emergency must be accompanied with scientific evidence, and indeed evidence that is clear out there, as it were. And it is interesting that in this occasion, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee is mentioning the area of science as needed to be clarified a bit more. If I should now come to our last observation by this committee, it's been in the area of primary legislation as imperative. COVID status certification must undergo primary legislation for it to operate. If I just bring to your attention that the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984 and Coronavirus Act 2020, both on medical treatment and vaccination, the Act of Parliament still stands that both these require consent, as it were. But as we will have noticed, the area of surrounding the COVID, already substantial changes from a legal perspective have been touched on. This seems to really have come up during the committee's deliberations. I just want you to listen to the observation that I was privy to when the chairperson, Mr. Ragg, asked the cabinet minister, Michael Gove, the Chancellor of Duchy, just listen to that in a while and see what we make of it.
Order. Good afternoon and welcome to a public session of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by 3 witnesses, and our primary focus shall be on the subject of COVID certification. I wonder if I could ask each of our witnesses to introduce themselves for the record, starting please with Michael Gove.
The Duchy of Lancaster and Minister at the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. And Dr. Susan Hopkins, please.
My name is Dr. Susan Hopkins. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor for NHS Test and Trace and the Strategic Director for COVID-19 Response in Public Health England.
Thank you. And Cathy Hall, please.
I'm Cathy Hall. I'm Director General in the Cabinet Office COVID-19 Task Force and supporting Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on the certification review.
Thank you. Before we launch into our main business, this is the committee not to momentarily at least dwell on some of the issues that were raised at yesterday's.
I would just like to follow that on with the question now.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, if you were to say this afternoon we weren't going to have this, we could shorten the session considerably, but I'm not quite sure if we're at that point yet. So could I just ask, does the government plan to introduce primary legislation to underpin such a system?
Were we to go ahead with a formal COVID status certification, then there are a range of potential legislative options. But if we were to have a legal change, then we would have a vote on the floor of the House of Commons. I think some people have made the point that secondary legislation, which would be done by means of statutory instruments in a committee, would be unsatisfactory. I agree with that. But it may be possible that if we need to go ahead, one can use secondary legislation, but have it debated and voted on the floor of the House by the whole House.
And before anything was introduced.
You'll have noticed the response from the cabinet minister was not forthright on primary legislation. The committee, I bring it up again, you'll have noticed, do the government plan to introduce primary legislation to underpin, that is, COVID status certification, such a system? You will see that the response of the cabinet minister or the minister in the cabinet office in blue at the end says, I agree with that, but it may be possible that if we need to go ahead, one can use secondary legislation, but have it debated and voted on the floor of the House by the whole House. It is interesting that the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee had this comment. If contrary to our recommendation, the government review concludes that it should move forward with proposals for any form of COVID status certification system within the UK, it is imperative that this is done through primary legislation. This is necessary to allow the full implications and ramifications of proposals to be properly considered by the government and to allow Parliament the appropriate amount of time to consider, scrutinize, debate, and where necessary, amend the government's proposals. They brought in almost like the backup the committee did, using the Bingham Center, really, which I forced to be reckoned with when it comes to the rule of law. From a rule of law point of view, any vaccine certificate scheme must be introduced using new primary legislation. delegated legislation, which was being hinted to earlier by Michael Gove, will not provide Parliament with a sufficient opportunity to review, debate, and amend the government's proposals. At the very end, it says, in addition, Parliament spends far less time debating secondary legislation than it spends debating primary legislation. Of course, the committee came back on the same issue again. The introduction of COVID status certification system would have a serious impact on businesses and individuals and has the possibility of infringing rights and being discriminatory in nature. In light of that, we believe that it would be inappropriate for a system with such potentially wide adverse impact to be introduced by secondary legislation. So you can see already the government may be leaning towards secondary legislation when underpinning COVID status certification, while the committee, the watchdog, is leaning towards primary legislation. Is that important to me? Yes. My audience need to know, as they make up their minds, the debate of this issue. Same thing, introduction of COVID status certification would have a serious impact on businesses and individuals and has the possibility of infringing rights and being discriminatory in nature. In blue at the bottom, this would allow for the full implications and ramifications of the proposals to be fully and properly considered by government, and would also allow Parliament the appropriate amount of time to consider, scrutinize, and where necessary, amend the government's proposals if it took the pathway of primary legislation. This was, to me, also very interesting. While this inquiry and the government's own review were being conducted, the government decided to preempt the findings of both and launched a COVID status certificate for international travel without notifying, consulting Parliament. This could be construed as contempt for Parliament, and this committee and this policy should have been set out in advance of any decision on the use of certification system being taken. At the bottom, as such, any proposals would likely to have been looked on favorably and strengthened through scrutiny of Parliament. So you can see locked horns. If this should move forward, should the public see it as a primary act, a primary legislation, or it doesn't matter, just go through delegated legislation? Very interesting. In conclusion, the South England Conference, Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department espouses liberty of conscience on COVID status certification system. Liberty of conscience. But what are we, with that said, encouraging our leaders, even the government? This was my submission in the last call for evidence from the Public Administration and the Constitutional Affairs Committee's request that there be a bridge of the difference between the vaccinated and not vaccinated. possibly it would be good for me to just share with you my simple analysis. This was based on the service provider, which is the government, the service user, which is me, as part of the public, and the criteria, provision, or the policy in question, passport, ID certificate, that all these come under the objective justification test. When considering this, that it meets a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, that this legal aspect really be given its fair share and understanding. To the Public Affairs and Constitutional Affairs Committee on COVID status certification, this was the statement the South England Conference shared with the committee, that the ethical dilemma surrounding the COVID-19 vaccination issue is this. On one hand, going unvaccinated exposes others to risk, we are told. That's one argument. And this violates their rights. But then, on the other hand, the curtailment of one's principle of consent inevitably infringes on their liberty of conscience. We are mindful. I'm mindful. The answer is not a simple one. And I don't pretend I have all the answers. But then I go on. Therefore, it demands that a delicate balance be struck between the two competing interests in the face of an ongoing and ever-evolving COVID-19 pandemic. The two. In fact, this was brought beautifully by a member of public in one of the number 10 Downing Street question time, Mr. Finlay, who I quote, the bridge the difference in opinion must not be lost sight of. That was a brilliant, to me, idea of looking at this. In red, the balancing of two competing interests in vaccination, acceptance or refusal is crucial. What do? Use the skills of persuasion and not draconian measures, so that both sides should comply to assist in minimizing the disadvantage of what? Of spreading the infection, which may lead to subsequent deaths. The two must be brought together. To achieve that means or that end, don't highlight one side. The issue must not be a one-sided issue, but do everything possible to bring the two to appreciate how they can cooperate to beat the pandemic. We started with a biblical principle. Let me end on one Jesus himself set out there, that you'll find challenges in life, but let that challenge, either whether you vote for or against, that challenge should give an opportunity for unanimity, to work together, to see things from other people's view. In Matthew chapter 10:16, Jesus says, behold, talking to his disciples, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Two separate entities. But then when you find yourself in that situation, which is a challenge, Be wise and harmless. Be wise and harmless. You know, there are times when you think you are locked into a situation which there may be no way out. The last thing you want to do is for the sheep to attempt to run away. Then they're in danger. But then to think, let's fight it out. No, you can't bite a wolf. But what is important, when you are faced with a challenge, it could be anyone, any challenge that you may face, remain wise and harmless. And in so doing, a situation which would have been unbearable will begin to resolve itself. No flight or fight mechanism helps more often, but one in which he who controls the sheep and the wolf, he who provides true wisdom, is able to make a way out. So we may not know when, if at all, it will be that places of worship will be demanded. COVID status certification. But I'm saying it's good for us to follow through at the moment what is happening calmly, but being able not only to decipher the information, but make up our minds while maintaining, as I said from the beginning, courtesy and respect. And finally, with the words of Jesus, be able to seize upon what is seemingly a challenge to be an opportunity. Having done so, the insurmountable may just be made plain. Thank you for listening. And we'll possibly be together in the further updating on other issues surrounding coronavirus, vaccination, and who knows what else. Thank you for listening.